Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a book that has been called everything from a 19th century fraud to a modern-day miracle. We're going to break down a source that lays out the evidence for the Book of Mormon, which is, without a doubt, one of history's most fascinating textual puzzles. So the whole thing really boils down to this one huge question. How on earth did a young man with very little formal education produce a book this dense and this historically complex? To really get a feel for the scale of what we're talking about, let's just look at a few key numbers from our source. First up, the book was dictated, not written, by Joseph Smith, who, according to the source, was just 22 years old at the time. And get this, he dictated the entire thing at an incredible speed. We're talking about 74 working days. I mean, think about that for a second. That's less than 3 months to produce a massive book, apparently without using any notes and without making any major revisions. And the result of all that? A book that's over 500 pages long, detailing 1,000 years of history for a civilization nobody had ever heard of before. So where do you even begin to unpack something like this? Well, the source we're looking at starts by cracking open the book itself, looking for clues inside the text. You could call them literary fingerprints, to figure out who or what is really behind it. Now, one of the main tools for this is a really cool field called stylometry, or word printing. Basically, it's a way of statistically analyzing a text to identify an author's unique writing style. It's kind of like a fingerprint, but for words. And when they ran this analysis on the Book of Mormon, the results were pretty startling. As you can see on this chart, the computer analysis that our source cites found up to 24 completely distinct authorial voices in the book. And here's the most important part. None of those voices match the writing style of Joseph Smith or any of his contemporaries. Okay, so that's one fingerprint. But the source points to another one, called chiasmus. This is a really complex, mirrored poetic structure that was super common in ancient Hebrew writing. But here's the kicker. Our source argues that this literary technique was pretty much totally unknown in the Western world back in the 1830s. All right, so the stuff inside the book is already a puzzle. But what about evidence from the outside world? So the next logical question is, right, does the book contain details that nobody could have possibly known in 1830, but that we've since discovered are actually true? A perfect example of this comes down to something as simple as names. Take the name Alma. Back in the 19th century, critics mocked it, saying it's obviously a woman's name. But then, decades later, archaeologists unearthed an ancient land deed that confirmed Alma as a genuine ancient Hebrew male name. Now, this timeline shows something that is just wild. It tracks all the so-called anachronisms in the book. That's just a fancy word for things that critics said were historically out of place. And as you can see, over the past 175 years, the trend has completely flipped. Things that were once considered proof of fraud are now, for the most part, being confirmed by modern archaeology. Okay, so you have these little details, these once supposed errors, that are now trending towards being authentic. Our source then zooms out to look at the biggest piece of external evidence in the entire book, the main journey itself. And what it finds is a path that by 19th century standards should have been completely impossible. I mean, think about it. If you were making up a story in 1830 about people from Jerusalem getting to America, the obvious choice is to have them sail west across the Atlantic, right? But the Book of Mormon describes this totally bizarre journey south, deep into the Arabian Peninsula, a route that at the time seemed completely nonsensical. And yet, and this is the crazy part, our source points out that this seemingly illogical journey is packed with these incredibly specific, accurate details. We're talking about finding a place called Nahom, a name later discovered on ancient altars right there in Yemen, and traveling due east along a path that we now know was an ancient incense trading route. These are things that were just not known in the Western world in 1829. So when you lay out all this internal and external evidence, you have to ask, what about the simplest explanation? How does the source answer the big charge that this whole thing was just a really clever fraud? This is where the source brings in the 3 witnesses. These were men who claimed they literally saw the golden plates. Now, what's so compelling about their story is that even after all 3 of them had a falling out with Joseph Smith and left the church, not one of them ever denied what they said they saw. Our source argues that sticking to that story for the rest of their lives, even with all that animosity, makes a simple fraud theory pretty hard to believe. And this leads the author to use this fantastic metaphor to kind of frame the whole debate. The idea is that the total evidence for the book is like this giant elephant in the room. But critics, the source argues, often just focus on tiny, unresolved issues, which is like taking shots at the elephant with a paintball gun. You're making a bit of a mess, but you're completely missing the elephant. All of this builds to the source's final and maybe most shocking conclusion. And it's one that's framed not in the language of faith, but in the cold, hard language of statistics. So someone actually ran the numbers on this. Using a statistical method called Bayesian analysis, they calculated the odds of Joseph Smith just guessing 131 of these specific, accurate details that are in the book. And the result? The source says the probability of the book being just a work of fiction is about 1 in 97 times billion. So what does that all add up to? Well, the ultimate conclusion of the source is that when you stack it all together, the internal complexity, the external facts that keep getting verified, that bizarre but weirdly accurate journey, you're left with a book that just seems impossible for its time. It's an anomaly that defies any simple 19th century explanation. So if you take fraud off the table, what are you left with? The source ultimately suggests that the most straightforward explanation for this impossible book is that it's exactly what it claims to be, a text revealed by God. And that leaves us all with a pretty provocative final question to chew on. If the evidence suggests it wasn't a 19th century creation, then what does that truly imply about where it came from?